Hello. So this is for History 17A, and this week we are on the New Republic. All right. So that's the one that you have for this week. And okay, so let's see here. Thank you, Ivan, for showing up. Or is it Ivana? I'm sorry. It's all put together as one name. I'll write it as it is. All right, so thank you for coming. I'll give you extra credit points. So with this one, right, we're looking at Great Man History and Melanie Lopez, I see. Good. We're looking for Great Man History of the Early Republic. Remember, Great Man History, that does not assume that it's saying nothing of the leaders that are being studied as great men, okay? But great is in power. Some people believe that history goes the directions in which it goes because of unseen large forces like the economy, the culture, etc. Great man history, which was kind of preceded that, it's kind of old school history. You don't see as much of it anymore in academia. They assume that what triggers events and what determines the avenue, the trajectory that history has headed is simply the decisions and the personalities of those in power. So they focus upon the president and his administration and the key leaders, and trying to discern why things went the way that they did. So that's what they mean by great man history, okay, of the early republic. We're looking at the leaders, and we're assuming that they were very pivotal in determining how history went direction-wise. All right. So with that in mind, you are looking at on the test for today, for test 2, you're looking at number 20, Hamilton system. Number 21, the alleged role that Hamilton played in eliciting or bringing about a second party. George Washington's concessions to the conservatives. George Washington's concessions to the liberals. David McCullough, his thesis on John Adams being a one-term president. The Alien and Sedition Acts, which were made by Congress under John Adams' administration. Hofstadter's thesis on Jefferson as a Democrat, in quotes. Jefferson's apparent contradictions, okay, concerning the Louisiana Purchase, then concerning his administration, then concerning the Barbary Coast War, then concerning slavery. So basically, in one way or another, we're covering numbers 20 through 30 on test number 2 study guide. Because remember, we only have one more subject after this week, the War of 1812, and then you have test number 2. So please be sure that you watch this video if you're not here. Prabjot, gee, good, nice to have you. And make sure you get your credit as well, okay? Let's see here.
So can you elaborate on what you meant, what pragmatic is? I still don't understand it.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Can you elaborate on what you said earlier about what pragmatic is?
Sure. So with pragmatic, right, we're saying that it's anything that is not necessarily to the left or the right, right? It's not necessarily ideological in that it's standing up for human rights and accountability of rulers, like on the left. It's not necessarily standing up for centralized power and rule by elites, like the conservative right side, but that it simply is, it's a practical decision to bring about a very practical result. So for instance, in Article 1, Section 8, basic things that Congress can do. raise an army, declare war, put down rebellions, spread mail through the post office service, decide things on weights and measures, right? We decided not to follow the metric system, to issue laws on patents with inventions. Those all could be considered just practical, not necessarily left or right, but just to bring about a practical result. Another one that might be considered pragmatic is the staggered elections in the Senate, right? Where you have a 6-year term, but at every 2 years, only 1/3 of those senators is elected. Then after 4 years, the second third, and after in the 6th year, the final third of the senators. And it's the idea, you know, kind of like in sports, that perhaps you don't want to take out all 5 of your starters in a basketball game and put them in with just 5 fresh, inexperienced players, but that you want to keep at least 2 of the 5, you know, on the court who have more experience and have been out there during that particular game and are warmed up and loose, etc. You could even decide, instead of conservative, that slavery was a pragmatic decision. Because remember, being pragmatic is it's amoral. It doesn't mean that you're not worried about an ideology. You're not worried about even what's right or wrong. You're just simply being practical to bring about a practical result. So the implicit acceptance of slavery could be seen as pragmatic because Charles Pinckney and several delegates from the South made it clear that they and their states would not ratify this Constitution if they took away their slaves. The idea of the states sharing powers of the federal government, right? A balance with the 10th Amendment says everything that's not given to the federal government explicitly or through the necessary and proper clause is left over to the states. You could argue that that was pragmatic for the same reason. It was a compromise to get the Delawares and the Connecticuts and the Vermonts, the small state assemblymen, who said if they didn't have some powers retained in their states, they would not be okay with ratifying this Constitution. Does that help at all?
Yes, I now understand it. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So yeah, just do your best on that. And I just, like I said, I just wanted even just one simple sentence as to why you put that particular clause section in that particular category of the 3 categories. And like I said, even doing just 4 in each category, that's okay with me. All right. Yeah, any other questions on that regarding the previous assignment? Okay, so moving on to this one, right? The joke is George Washington was fearless in battle, but he was scared to death as a civilian leader. And you know, you have personal anecdotal stories to show that he was not the most socially at ease of leading statesmen. He was insecure about his lack of formal education. He was could seen as being a bit obstinate and very proud as an individual. And so he already had that against him. But he wrote he had more than one, but he had one particular famous quote where he's concerned that partisanship is going to tear this new republic apart before it even has a chance to strengthen itself. And to me, partisanship, right, implies that your adherence, your stubborn and even confrontational adherence to your own faction's goals. And remember, a faction, Madison simply explained as a group of like-minded people who share the same beliefs and or share the same self-interest, right? Or to him, partisanship was a bad word in which it implied that you only worried about your own faction, even at the expense of the entire nation and of what's best for other factions. The opposite of that, right, which George Washington spoke about, was civic virtue. Tacitus and who's the other guy? Cicero, back in Rome, had written about that, and the founding fathers quoted them as Roman writers, saying, right, that you should disregard what's in your selfish best interest as a farmer, as an artisan, as a merchant, etc., but be more broad-minded and selfless in determining what's best for the country as a whole, right? So to Washington, partisanship was the antithesis to civic virtue. It was selfishness writ large, okay? And so he didn't like that. So the idea was that he kind of tried to play a juggling act, which included not only trying to concede to both the left and the right as the president, but also to try to avoid getting caught into that struggle as much as possible, trying to avoid as many battles as possible between the left and the right. He tried to convey himself, and remember, it wasn't because this man was necessarily intent on staying popular or worried about getting reelected, but according to all his quotes and so forth, if they could be taken at face value is another issue. He contended that he literally was worried about the survival of the republic. Because remember, the war ends in 1783 against Britain, and by 1787, they're scrapping their first government. So that Articles of Confederation lasted just during the war and 4 more years after the war for independence. And so they had developed perhaps almost a paranoia that this new system that they devised in Philadelphia of 1787 may not last either. So at any rate, his concessions to the left and to the right. First of all, those on the left, especially by the end of his second term, really laid into Washington in the press in stating that he was secretly, okay, thank you, Kenner. Let me get your name down. That he was secretly on the right, okay? Along with Madison. Well, Madison initially, Madison's going to switch sides, and but namely with Alexander Hamilton. So, for instance, his desire to try to refute or allay that fear of those on the left that he was on the right himself. Washington established press conferences. He established daily walks, and he would allow himself to be joined by people and shake hands and speak. He went on a goodwill tour. He did symbolic things like that to try to show that he was not an aloof aristocratic monarch like George III of England that they had broken from, but that he was the first man of the people. He was a man who get into the trenches, shake hands, kiss babies, show the public through the press conferences and his public walks, be transparent and present himself as an accountable executive. So hence a democratic republic's president, not a monarch. Also, the Aurora, the Gazette, and several newspapers at that time tore into Washington, and he was not accustomed to that. And he was a very proud man. And they were saying that he had betrayed the spirit of 1776, in which the country was fighting for these enlightened principles, right? Of natural rights for all people, accountability of the governed, economic opportunities for all, etc. And they said that he was betraying that revolution of 1776 and going too far to the right. Well, he didn't shut down any of the press. He didn't have anyone arrested. He didn't try to manipulate or extort any of those press writers, but he certainly took umbrage to it, and it was visible how frustrated he was with that criticism. But he allowed that to happen, and you think, of course, he allowed it to happen. It was already in the Bill of Rights. But my goodness, look how many times in human history that that even right off the bat, a constitutional government is strayed from eventually or even initially in human history. So he adhered to that. He went to New York and he gave a famous speech to a group of Hebrew or Jewish Americans. And it's to this day kind of a symbolic quote from an American president about freedom of religion in this country and allowing the Jewish Americans to allow the full rights of citizenship here in this republic. So notice he did some things to try to allay the fears of the left who wanted great changes from the past, right? Also his cabinet, he put in liberal Edmund Randolph, liberal Thomas Jefferson, and others, right, who tended to be on the left side of the spectrum. He put them in his cabinet as well as men on the right, like obviously Hamilton. So those are some concessions that he gave to the left in this so-called balancing act. And not to mention, remember, is before we established the Republic and we were still in the midst of the Confederacy, he publicly relinquished his sword as the leader of the Continental Army because under Scottish Whig liberalism, right, the Second Amendment type guys and libertarians, government don't tread on me, they were fearful of any kind of standing army in the time of peace and giving too much power to a military leader, but rather it'd be a lesser evil, the Scottish liberals thought, to give more power to an elected body of civilian leaders who have control over the military. So you don't end up with as likely of a chance of having a military dictatorship as far as threats upon our future liberty. So at any rate, he gave those concessions. There was something called the Society of the Cincinnati, and Cincinnatus and Roman political sources was a guy who didn't want to become the 6-month dictator that the 12 Tables Roman Constitution made allowance for in times of insurrection or civil war. But he supposedly grudgingly did it. And as soon as he militarily won the day, he immediately gave that power up. That's the type of guy they wanted, right? Someone who wasn't thirsty for power and too ambitious. So they named it after that Cincinnatus guy, and the Society of the Cincinnati. They were for putting in George Washington as chief executive for life. And there was almost an excessive amount of hero worship of him amongst these elite gentlemen. George Washington publicly repudiated them and their claims, said that was too far to the right, that he was going to be elected, maybe a second time, and then he would leave, and he was not ever intent upon becoming a king of any sort. To the right, however, right, like I said, mainly the long leash, so to speak, that he gave Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton did a lot of controversial things, and George Washington did not seem to try to institutionally stop them, much less to even privately harangue him in any way. So his lack of action and his quiet response to a lot of people was interpreted as an implicit okay, an implicit patronage or support of what Hamilton was doing. So let's get into some of that with Hamilton, all right? So first of all, Hamilton, right? Remember, this is a guy, you have all these ironies. Hamilton was born as a, quote, bastard child in the Dutch West Indies and came from nothing, apprenticed himself to a mercantile company in New York who were so impressed by him that they paid for him to go to Columbia College. It was called King's College at that time. Super bright, got his degree, became a lawyer. Just a really kind of a rags to riches story, right? But once he made it up top, a lot of his rhetoric and speeches and stands were very kind of elitist and stating that basically only people like himself, only the cream of the crop, the most talented, the most intelligent ought to be the ones that govern this country. So at any rate, Hamilton already came across as a right-wing elitist to those on the left like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. So when he comes in, he decides, right, that first of all, he wants to resume the debts of the states, okay? The different states during the Confederation, for various reasons, had accrued great debts, sometimes even internationally to foreign countries and bankers. but also namely to domestic creditors. And so he took a very, I would make the argument, non-ideological, but more practical approach to this and said, we need to stand on our own 2 feet. Our immediate threat is England trying to reattempt, like Spain would do in Latin America, to take us over again, or nearby Spain or France along the Mississippi River in the Louisiana Territory. So to him, we need to stand on our feet economically, first and foremost. And to do that, we need to get out of debt, if for no other reason, not only to make a healthier economy, but to establish future credibility with lenders and bankers, right, throughout the world, the Western world, so that they in the future would continue to be willing to lend to state legislators, to lend to National Congress, etc. Actually, after the Confederacy, they can't lend to states alone. So at any rate, so what might be wrong with that, right? The notion is, if you think like a good libertarian, what the government does today to step its foot proverbially into your home to do for good and your own benefit and help today, it could use that same encroachment and power for evil tomorrow. So that was a notion amongst the libertarians in the southern states. They said, hey, we'll deal with our own state debt. We don't want you getting your hands in our budget and our economy, because once you help us, there's no getting you out, right? And he also wanted to subsidize industry and infrastructure. Let me go over both of those. Industry, right? He wanted us to become self-sufficient economically as a country. He saw that under the mercantilist laws, we were meant to provide raw materials to Great Britain, and we were at their mercy in buying their finished manufactured products. And England wanted it that way, in somewhat of a parasitical manner. So to him, he wanted to get rid of our economic colonization, if you will, dependence, subservience to England and her economy. He thought that was a sure way to stay secure in our political independence, as well as becoming economically independent. But the problem is, right, if you theoretically come across capital, you get a loan, your dad has money, etc. So you have money to start a business. Theoretically, Hamilton reasoned, people are going to take the road of least resistance. They're going to find whatever service, whatever product, whatever industry requires the least amount of work and brings about the quickest, easiest, most profits, right? So what happens if you think, okay, we need to manufacture more of our own clothing. We need to manufacture our own guns and gunpowder and ammunition. We need to manufacture our own metallurgical metal products, right? Pig iron, etc., and copper, etc. Well, those sometimes in some of those cases, and how much more in the case of railroads by the 1840s, and before that, turnpikes or toll roads and canals, is he thought we need to diversify with everything and have all these new industries sprout. And we also need to connect the region so that they could trade with one another, right? To get the production of that product connected by a road or a canal to the market where it could be sold. And so to him, right, he felt like he had to make it worth the while to these entrepreneurs, these business owners, to engage in a variety of products and services that would help out the entire country, allegedly. So, like I said, a better example of this is by the 1840s with railroads. Like, okay, an average businessman is not going to opt for a railroad. He's got to buy so much in iron products. He has to measure things out and hire so many skilled workers. He has to hire so many day laborers. He's got to pay all that overhead out long before he finishes those tracks and can charge a cent to anyone to put their freight or to ride as passengers on that train. So at any rate, the government, according to Hamilton, says, we'll make it worth your while. So you will choose to build railroads, which will help the whole country. So for every mile of track that you lay, we will give you 14 acres surrounding those railroad tracks for free as a railroad company. And you could sell that land that we're giving you for free for nothing but profit to the general public. So, so with Hamilton, he's wanting to help out the origins of multiple businesses. Okay. And so then in addition to that, is as a means to an end, he thought, okay, first of all, we need to bring in money. How can we subsidize anyone if we're not making any money and we're already in debt right now? So for one, he was heavily into bonds. Remember, a bond is a government certificate that you purchase. And in a sense, you're lending the government as a private individual money, and the government is going to pay you that money back plus interest. So you make money off of lending money to the government. So he issued bond certificates, right? Well, who is going to provide the lion's share of bond loan money to the government? The wealthy. They're the ones who have the extra money to do this. So he really curries favor with the wealthy in the US to purchase these bonds, promises them high interest rates in return, appealing to their greed so that they'll do it, right? And not to mention, he is okay with being Secretary of the Treasury of issuing taxes on certain commodities to bring about profit, again, just like through bonds, to give the government money to subsidize different industries, right? To help economic diversification, diverse industries to develop so we could become self-sufficient economically. But what does this look like, you guys? So first of all, he wants to intervene in the states and take over their debts. So that looks like Big Brother in Washington, D.C., although it wasn't D.C. yet. They were in Philadelphia and New York first before D.C. But at any rate, that Washington, D.C., the federal government wants to get its hands in the states' budgets, right? Subsidizing the big industrialists and borrowing from them, right? That smacked of plutocracy, plutocracy. A plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy, whose self-interest are intertwined with the interest of the governing authorities. So big government and big business are in cahoots together. Plutocracy was a bad word then and now, and it scared the heck out of libertarian liberals who did not want big government and certainly did not rule by the rich. And so this is all looking poorly, you guys, to the liberals, and it's causing concern as he's doing these things. And then how ironic, right? Taxes. What does the Constitution say, right, from a previous assignment? Is all laws pertaining to taxes, to the requisition of funds from civilians, must originate in the House of Reps. Because, of course, we cried out during the War for Independence, no taxation without representation. We need to give our elected reps, need to give approval for whatever taxes are given to the people. So remember, the president is not even directly elected, but through electoral college, and he handpicks his cabinet. So Hamilton is not in an elected position. So hence the people did not give their consent to these taxes, but he's taxing anyway. And how ironic, I kid you not, one of the products that he taxed was tea. Remember the Boston Tea Party and all that drama with the British. So at any rate, that's what I want you to be familiar with Hamilton's system, okay? And so, and then lastly, he establishes, and bringing about this system, an American bank, a national bank. 2 of the 5 members of the bank on the leading board were private civilians, big bankers, and 3 of the 5 were governmental officials. So this was a quasi, almost private bank, but mainly a public governmental bank. We'll look at Article 1, Section 8, powers given to Congress. Look at Article 2 throughout the executive powers. You will not find anything anywhere there explicitly stating that anyone in the federal government has the constitutional right to create a national bank. But he did anyway, right? Then what makes matters worse is it goes to the Supreme Court to decide if it's constitutional or not, okay? And the Supreme Court makes the decision that it is constitutional. And remember, these are handpicked dudes for life, so they're not beholden to popular opinion, these Supreme Court justices. But they contend that the bank is actually constitutional. Why? Because Article 1, Section 8 does state that the government can raise tax revenue and funds and decide how to allocate that revenue and can regulate interstate trade. He says, therefore, because of the necessary and proper clause, be sure you get that down. The necessary and proper clause that you may have found at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, if you're a libertarian, that scares you to death because it looks like it can be used as a blank check. Oh yeah, here are the only things that Congress can do, specifically stated. Oh, but look at this bottom part. They also shall do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out anything on that list. And so it just looks like a clause to be easily exploited by the federal government to give itself more and more powers that the Constitution does not explicitly give to them. So because it was supported by an unelected group of men in the Supreme Court who cited as the rationale one of the scariest clauses to liberals at that time, the necessary and proper clause, right? This was too much for many liberals. So James Madison, the quiet man who wrote most of the constitutions, wrote about factions and elected reps being filters, a strong central government, he flops. He switches to Jefferson's party of the liberals and libertarians, claiming that Hamilton has gone too far to the right. He has usurped, taking for himself more powers than ever were intended in the Constitution. And he also is getting the government way too involved in the economy at the expense, oftentimes they thought, of small businessmen and the common man. So are there any questions on that?
No questions.
Thank you. Oh, Tristan, there we go. I'm glad that you said that, Tristan. Make sure you get your credit. So far I have Ivana Lupian, Melanie Lopez, Prabtaj, Kenner, and Tristan. Okay, Shelly Kuhn, okay. Thank you. Okay, so moving from there, McCullough on number 2, also in the handout out on the test, David McCullough, historian on John Adams. Look for the fact. This is a very pro kind of court history of John Adams. It's making an excuse for him. No problem, Shelley. It's making an excuse for John Adams, claiming that it was not his fault that he failed to be elected for a second term. So our second president after Washington from 1796 to 1800 was John Adams, and he was our first one-term president. He lost for re-election in 1800 to Jefferson. So why is that? McCullough says it was for no poor or reason that he should be ashamed of. So the French and the British are fighting, right? This continental war in the midst of the French Revolution. And John Adams made it clear that the French Revolution frightened the heck out of him. He thought that it was, quote, excessive, that it went too far, that he was all for individual rights. He was all for even changing much of the ancien regime, of the old way of governing before the Enlightenment and before the French Revolution, where you had divine right of kings and queens, noblemen getting most of the positions of power and most of the economic opportunities and land access. He was all for changing that, but he wanted it done in a very sophisticated legal way, approved by elected legislators, etc., right? And he certainly didn't want class warfare against the wealthy, like what was happening when the Jacobins took over the French Revolution, and they began declaring all noblemen in France as enemies of the state simply for being of that economic class, and executing them for being such. The French Revolution attacked the Catholic Church. And although he wasn't Roman Catholic, John Adams was an adamant Christian, and he thought anything that attacked the Catholic Church, especially killing priests, was nothing short of him of evil, literally of the devil. And so when this war goes on, those on the left, the liberals, tended to be more pro-France in this continental war, and saying, yeah, the French they're taking it to a pretty radical extent, but at least it's a lesser evil than the way things were before the revolution. They need some great democratic changes, right? And so a lot of them sided with France. So what does John Adams do? Is he comes in, and initially he seemed to have sided with England, thought that we held much more in common with England. Like I said, thought the French Revolution had become way too excessive, violent, scary, anti-Christian. And so what he does is he notices that the French, when they find American merchant vessels, and there's already kind of notions of articles of war, of international rights, long before NATO and the UN, at these different conventions that the European leaders had met each other in, and also from the Catholic Church, something that was called just war doctrine from at least the 300s. So at any rate, it was long held that we as Americans have neutral rights to trade to both warring sides, to the British and to their Napoleonic French enemies, because we're neutral. Well, the French especially began attacking American merchants that were trying to trade to the British, because they were each trying to blockade and literally starve each other out on their coastal cities, starve them into submission with sieges upon their major coastal cities. So this was in violation of our international rights. But what he does is pretty severe, is he helps raise and put into motion our Navy. And he has the Navy do a convoy system twice a year, where they escort our merchants into European waters or Caribbean waters. And if a French naval frigate tries to fire upon those merchants and infringe upon their international right to trade with whomever they choose, our Navy will fire upon them. So this was known as a quasi or almost war, because it was never declared by Congress, but people died on both sides. There were actual battles against the French Navy. And so the left hated this, and they hated the fact that John Adams tended to side with the British in these wars. Not to mention, Adams said some publicized quotes that made him look terrible as an elitist, saying basically, oftentimes the masses are asses and will get things wrong, and out of their ignorance and being led by their natural impulses will make rash decisions. So he had a way of using his mouth also in alienating the left. And then if that didn't do it, his Congress, his Federalist Congress, passed two constitutionally doubtful, dubious laws, okay? One was the Alien Act. And Congress, under Article 1, Section 8, is given the power over making decisions over immigration and naturalization. they gave that power to the president in the Alien Act and gave him the right to deport any radicals, particularly French immigrant radicals here in the US, who are stirring up trouble. Because ever since the time that Citizen Genet, he was called, came and did a tour on behalf of Jacobin revolutionary France throughout the US, he wanted Americans to join the French Revolution, literally come and fight as mercenaries, and also to raise funds and help the French army with resources. And so ever since that Citizen Genet tour and episode, right, the right was very angry and concerned with the left because they started establishing Jacobin and other democratic clubs and associations throughout the eastern states, that some of which raised money to help out the French army and revolution. And remember, Washington had declared us to be neutral. So that's a violation of our neutral responsibilities. So with the Alien Act, they gave the president power to deport anybody that was stirring up trouble and trying to support the French Revolution here. The Sedition Act, arguably even more of an infringement upon the Constitution and its limitations and checks and balances, is it was a limitation on our First Amendment rights, and stating, right, that if in your self-expression you promoted in any way defiance of the American government, you are not allowed to say or write those words and then make that expression. So really they curtailed, they cut short through the Sedition Act what was covered historically as our First Amendment right of expression. All right. However, in alienating the right, John Adams did not enforce those controversial laws very well. And to a lot of people, it was evident that he knew that they were both constitutionally dubious. And so he was very careful and not trying to ruffle too many feathers, and may have almost had moral qualms himself with the laws themselves. So he didn't enforce them worth a darn. Also, despite his quasi or almost war with France, he removed his pro-British ambassador to France that had been under Washington and sent a pro-French gentleman there and pleaded with him and said, do all that you can to keep peace with Napoleonic France, because we don't want to have to actually go to war with them. Those on the right were furious over this because they thought, John Adams, you're teasing us. You're pro-England, anti-French Revolution, but you won't get us involved in the war. So notice what he's doing. He's alienating both the left and the right. And then in Fry's Rebellion, there was a rebellion that started with a protest rally. The guy gave a long speech, and in the midst of the speech, violence broke out and some people were killed. Just like the Whiskey Rebellion that you read hopefully in the textbook, or you do this week, the people on the right wanted to make sure that anything like Old Shays' Rebellion under the Confederacy would not be tolerated. That if there's any kind of insurrection and loss of law and order, the government was going to crack down on it. But John Adams refused to crack down on Mr. Fry's and the leaders at this rally because he had been a lawyer, and he stated that technically the guy never had said anything to encourage violence, that people did it on their own. And so he let Fry's, he pardoned him, and people on the right were furious. Also on the far right were Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams could not stand Hamilton. He thought he was vain and too ambitious, and it was about himself and the attention he could get rather than wanting to truly serve the best interest of the country. And so he made a powerful enemy in Hamilton, right? And on the right. And also those on the right and left were flabbergasted when the Haitian Revolution happened in Santo Domingo or Haiti. And the Black slaves rose up and at one point had either killed or had chased off the island virtually every white Frenchman. and they started a People's Republic of black slaves and African Haitians. And it didn't last, but while it was going on and it was succeeding, John Adams actually supported it because John Adams was an abolitionist and thought good for these slaves. And it's good for the people to see that black men could establish a republic just like white men can. So the point being with McCulloch is John Adams was too independent-minded for his own political survival. He was too honest. He adhered to his own principles, whether they were pro-left or pro-right. And largely he thought, McCulloch thinks in this biography, this book, that it was largely because of his religious faith, that John Adams was one of the most staunchly Christian presidents we've ever had, and habitually would state that he assumed that he would be held accountable by God when he died for every decision he had made as president, and wanted to do that which was right, not that which was popular or that which was in accordance to his own political party. So he was supposedly too honest, too independent-minded, too virtuous for his own good, and he made enemies on both the left and the right, and therefore no good deed goes unpunished. He loses re-election. All right. And then lastly, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, look at the Hofstadter thesis. I find this to be fascinating. I think it's number 3. Hofstadter paints a picture of a very fragile, non-confrontational, passive-aggressive man in Thomas Jefferson. He contends that there are many paradoxes about him, and the way he resolves those paradoxes is through a psychological thesis, okay, on how he thought Jefferson's mind worked and his emotions. Jefferson's mom, Jane Randolph, was of high-ranking Scottish nobility. He could have been a hand-picked councilman in Virginia if he wanted to, on behalf of his mother's maiden name, the Randolphs, but he chose not to. Jane Randolph, his mother, married down to a lowly farmer named Peter Jefferson because she thought he was handsome. She liked his integrity, thought he was a hard worker, and he was a well-liked guy in his region. And so she marries down. But according to Hofstadter, the historian, in his book, he says that Jane Randolph's mother and father, the in-laws, they lived with all of them, with Peter Jefferson, Jane, and their son Thomas, and that they constantly threw in their son-in-law's face their disdain, their class disdain, and saying they resented the fact that their daughter deserved better and that she married down to him, Peter Jefferson, someone whom that did not deserve her. And supposedly it created tension in the household. So couple that with the fact that Jefferson, you have by his own written accounts, habitually would try to spend time with his dad, and in particular, try to get his hands dirty out on the farm and engage in mechanical pursuits, etc. And all too often, his father was a bit aloof, distant to him, and would tell him, no, son, use that Randolph blood and go get educated so that you don't have to get your hands dirty like I do. And so that Thomas Jefferson resented the arrogance, the sense of entitlement of his mother and of his mother's parents. He did not, according to this thesis, have the guts, the confrontational courage to take them on about it. And he also had issues with his dad not giving him the affirmation and approval and affection that he needed and wanted. So combine those together, right? And Hofstadter thinks that Thomas Jefferson's public persona in being a man of the people and being for a democratic republic, right? And entrusting and romanticizing the common man in the country, he thinks was a result of psychological damage and a passive aggression. Psychological damage. He thinks that Thomas Jefferson was trying to win over the common people and be seen as a man who was not pretentious, not self-entitled, but a humble servant of the people, perhaps to gain his dad's approval. And because perhaps he projected his idealization and romanticization of his dad onto other common farmers, okay? And that his disdain for anything regal, anything aristocratic, anything pompous and arrogant as a way of indirectly lashing out at his own mother and at his maternal grandparents for their haughtiness, their arrogance, and self-entitlement. I thought that was a fascinating thesis. So that's Hofstadter's take on why Jefferson championed himself with his public image as being a man of the common people, trying to compensate for what may have been a degree of wealth guilt, feeling like his dad would never see him anything other than a spoiled Randolph kid. Then Brinkley, right? Look at Brinkley and note his thesis regarding the contradictions of Jefferson. Jefferson had his rhetoric over here, okay, and his actions as president over here. There's another guy in your 17B class named Woodrow Wilson. These two presidents are most known for that, for being very liberal on paper, but a lot of their decisions, ironically, as president and policies seem to be very conservative. So why is that? How do we reconcile that contradiction? Brinkley, right? You should be able to get that answer right away in the introduction of chapter 7 of your textbook. The quiz for which I'm going to put on as soon as I'm done with this Zoom for this week, okay? So with Jefferson, he contends forces larger than Jefferson. Not to mention that Jefferson is kind of a cowardly, non-confrontational, bashful man. But that forces larger than Jefferson were just considered too strong by him to resist and fight off. So he grudgingly became more practical, more pragmatic, rather than idealistic the way he used to be and wanting to improve everything. That he just worked with what he had because supposedly these forces were too large to contend against. So what are some examples? First of all, Hamilton's system that we've already mentioned. He had a liberal Secretary of the Treasury who gave a thorough investigation of Hamilton's bank and system and came back to Jefferson and said, as much as I would love to demolish this bank and his system of subsidies to all these big businesses, he said, if we take this out, the rug out from underneath it, there will be a terrible economic domino effect on the country. So begrudgingly, supposedly, Jefferson felt compelled to keep Hamilton's system intact when he became president. Okay. Also, education. You should see that there were small advancements in education at this time because Jefferson would have loved this, right? Because he wanted a national crusade against ignorance. He wanted the common people to be as well equipped for citizenship and for participation in government as possible. And to him, that namely entailed becoming educated to make wiser decisions. And so, but notice that is a state issue because it's not under Article 1 or 2. And so the 10th Amendment arguably reserves education to the states, as not previously mentioned. And the states, by and large, did not yet bring about a subsidized, free public school system, and especially how much more not for African Americans or Native Americans, etc. So then partisanship. Thomas Jefferson claimed in his inaugural speech, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, right? Contending, right, that most of the founding fathers were in the middle of the political spectrum and they're not that different in their fundamental beliefs, and that he was not going to be radical as their new president. to try to allay the fears of the right when he was elected. Nevertheless, he was very partisan in his cabinet members and ambassadors, etc. He almost only arguably put in yes men who are of the same party and political beliefs as he. He was very partisan in his appointments. He was all for intellectual openness and debate, but he would not allow his cabinet members to be even different enough in their ideology to help bring about a debate, but much less he was not okay with a debate even if they did disagree, because again, of his supposedly delicate nature. He would squirm when people argued in his presence. So notice these are all contradictions, right? Slavery. In the Declaration of Independence, he wrote scathingly against the institution of slavery. When he was writing to a French aristocratic friend and what would become Notes on the State of Virginia, he wrote about how backward and how dangerous and detrimental slavery was as a system. But he had about 164 slaves at any given time, and he didn't even free them on his death, right? And as one example of the unhealthy state of slavery in his writings on the Notes on the State of Virginia, is Jefferson noticed that when white masters developed sexual relationships with their black slave women, he said that you have a black woman who is in a powerless situation, who basically in many respects cannot say no to the advancements of the white master. And so that hence any pretense of having an amorous relationship is fake, he said, because you're making sycophants of the slaves. A sycophant, right, is like a court sycophant, is someone who's at such the mercy for any opportunities, freedoms, powers, protections, at such the mercy of the arbitrary power of someone above him or her, that person cannot help but be a brown noser, be insincere and flatter, and not truly feel free to be genuinely honest with what he or she thinks about the person above him. And so how ironic, he develops an affair after his wife dies in childbirth. Years later, he develops an affair with one of his slaves that he inherited from his father-in-law named Sally Hemings. Now, on the one hand, he regularly took her to France, where he thought they were more progressive over there and would be more accepting. And he held her hand and took her to theater, etc., and dinner, almost as if an equal, like his wife. But not so whenever he came back to the United States. He would not take a public stand over this affair. But in fact, when the affair got out and got to the press, he refused to free their biracial kids, whom he had promised to free. One of them was Beverly. It was a son. And Beverly was so angry that his dad went back, this biracial son, that his dad, Thomas Jefferson, had gone back on his promise, that he ran away. And we don't know of him ever seeing Beverly again. Sally Hemings one time threatened that she was going to stay in France and never return to the U.S. Another time she gave Thomas Jefferson an ultimatum to acknowledge her and free her and her kids, or she would leave him. And of course, that ultimatum didn't work. He never took a stand publicly for her, sadly, and ends up losing those biracial children who were sent away. And so it's a really sad story, but his hypocrisy with slavery. And of course, he makes the argument was that he says, I'm a lesser evil. I'm an enlightened master. I treat my slaves well. They respect me and like me. They would only be under someone worse if I set them free, and that my present generation is not ready to see the slaves freed. So basically, he thought his anti-slavery beliefs were too far ahead of his own time, and he didn't have the courage to take that crusade on. Okay, so again, the thesis that forces larger than Jefferson supposedly made him feel compelled to violate his own belief system. Then also, he wrote in the Declaration of Independence that one of the examples of a king misusing his power was sending boys to fight to their own deaths in unauthorized wars that had not yet been passed and approved by the legislator, by Parliament. And he does just that as president, right? He gets us involved in a Barbary Coast or Tripolitan war in Muslim North Africa, primarily Tunisia. So they had a system of piracy whereby they were stopping American merchants and not only confiscating their goods, but abducting them and selling them for ransom, oftentimes over in Istanbul, Turkey, where there was a big slave market. Jefferson said he couldn't handle this anymore, and so couldn't withstand it. And so he sent the Marines there without Congress's approval. And it was called the USS Philadelphia, and they were sent into a trap into these high reefs and shoals and coral, and they got caught. And the Barbary Corsair pirates under a basha, like a governor, a Muslim governor there, abducted them and held them for ransom. These are American Marines and Navy cadets, right? Over 100 of them held for ransom. Then he secretly sends a guy named John Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, to try to go and find the brother who was the rightful heir to his dad's throne, but this younger brother, Yusuf Karamanli, Yusuf had killed an older brother to get the position and chased out this other brother, okay, as well. And this other brother's name was Ahmed. So John Eaton was sent secretly to find Ahmed. He was given money so that he could try to fund a mercenary army and have Yusuf, the Basha there, overthrown in a military coup and have the new brother Ahmed take over. And the first thing Ahmed would do was make a promise diplomatically that he would end this formalized piracy of American ships in the Mediterranean Sea. Well, it didn't happen. It failed. But the point being, here he is saying, as a strict constructionist, Thomas Jefferson, no president or congressman for that matter can or should do anything that's not explicitly given to him in the Constitution. Where does it state that a president can send boys to go fight before Congress has its power and exercises it to raise an army and to declare a war first? Where does it say that a president could help try to establish a coup, C-O-U-P, a blow to the state, and overthrow a leader of another sovereign country? Obviously, it doesn't anywhere in the Constitution. And so this Corsair War, this Tripolitan War, Barbary Coast War, went on for years before Congress gave its okay to declare war. So ironic again, Jefferson going against his own rhetoric. Then, as a strict constructionist, of course, read about the purchase of the Louisiana Territory when you do this quiz in Chapter 7. And him buying the Louisiana Territory, his ambassadors, from Napoleonic France. And look, does it say anywhere that the president has a right to buy territory from a foreign nation? No. So he stretched his powers again. Then, when he established government over the Louisiana Territory that he recently had bought, does he allow democratic rule, being a man of the people? No. He puts in a military government with a hand-picked council of hand-picked men under him, he says, because they were not ready to achieve statehood status yet. So how ironic, right? This Jefferson guy, he's a puzzle of a man, seems to have contradicted his own former beliefs time and time again. All right. So are there any questions?
No questions. It's all good.
Okay, good. That's good to hear. Anybody else? Last minute questions?
I don't have any either.
Okay, good, good, good. All right. Well, then if that's the case, you guys, we'll go ahead and call it a day. I thank you for participating. Like I said, we'll give you your extra credit points. Those of you who did, I will publish this as soon as I can. Thank you. I appreciate your gratitude. And I'll see you next week, okay? So don't forget to do the Early Republic handout by Sunday night, as well as Chapter 7 quiz that I am going to post very shortly. All right, so have a good day, okay, guys? Hang in there. You're doing well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.